This is a presentation of the 19th Annual Colorado Snow and Avalanche Workshop, a program of the Colorado Avalanche Information Center, Friends of CAIC, and the National Avalanche Center, presented by Dinafit and Pomoka.
Hi, I'm Grant Statham with Parks Canada in Banff National Park. In 2004, Parks Canada and others developed the Avalanche Terrain Exposure Scale, which is a straightforward method of terrain assessment that gives people a sense of their exposure to avalanche terrain, and it classifies it into different degrees of exposure. That system was launched 16 years ago, and it's been quite successful. It's used in all the jurisdictions in Canada, and lots of other places in the world have picked it up as well. But since that time, of course, it was a new system in 2004. There have been things we've noticed that were wrong or that we wanted to change, or things that weren't quite working well. And so over the last 2 years, we've started working on a revision for it. And we were able to pick up a bit of speed on that revision this spring when we were pinned at home and in the park on our own. And that's what this presentation is about today. So the Avalanche Terrain Exposure Scale was first launched in 2004, and we've used it successfully for many things in the national parks since then. Our primary use of it is for public warnings for recreation. So people who want to go ski touring or ice climbing or snowshoeing or something like that will use the system to get a sense of the exposure of the trip they're looking at to avalanche terrain. We've also used it for policy for land management about where people can and can't go. We use it for that. It's also used widely for workplace safety in Canada. Many avalanche safety plans rely on the AITS ratings to determine where people can work and not work, etc. So it's got broad use, and included in that is guidebooks. It's been used widely in ski touring and climbing guidebooks, and also in education. So it's been picked up pretty well. What it looks like, if you haven't seen it before, is it's pretty simple. It has two methods. It has what we call a public communication model, which is pretty straightforward. This is it right here. Divides the terrain into 3 different bins: simple, challenging, and complex terrain. And then you can see the descriptions of them there. But behind that is a technical model, which looks like this. And that's what we use to actually do the classifying, to do the assessment work. And this has the various parameters on the left: slope, angle, slope, shape, and you can see it continues right down through route options, exposure time, and glaciation at the bottom, and then all the different parameters in the middle, with some defaults. So in this particular example, defaults mean that if the terrain fits that criteria with the bold default, then it's automatically in that category. So when we first built this system, the way we published it at the national park was on paper brochures back in the day. Now it's on the web, of course, but similar method. We used it as an opportunity for teaching and training of people, and these brochures contain lots of information about avalanche terrain and good practice in the backcountry, things like that. On the left, we have one for backcountry ski touring in all the national parks, and on the right is for ice climbing. We've republished these brochures 6 times over the last years. And we published them on the web. Each time we've updated these brochures, we've changed a few ratings, because when you publish 300 trips, you're bound to get not all of them perfect. So we've been slowly but surely improving our ratings each time we republish. This is what it looks like on the back. Pretty simple. Just all the different trips. You can see green is simple terrain, blue is challenging terrain, and black is complex terrain in the various parks. So in 2012, Cam Campbell, Brian Gould started working on something called the AITS zoning model. And this is a slightly different way of using AITS. You can see they made a couple of really important additions when they did this. The first is class 0. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about class 0 in just a minute here, but that was an important addition. The other thing they did was they merged slope, incline, and forest density into one parameter. And what you can see here is a fairly complex breakdown of different slope angles, so difficult to use for just reading it. But if you're going to use this for any kind of DEM or a GIS-based application, then this is how you want to use it as your first filter, as it breaks the terrain apart for you pretty easily. So a different application of AITS. And the way they did it is they applied these ratings to entire zones and areas, not to specific trips. So it wasn't for a particular ski tour or a particular ice climb, it was for a broader area. And they called this the zoning model. The way that Avalanche Canada applied this was, you can see it here as a good example. This is one of the many maps that they've made. This is for the gorge, which is west of Revelstoke. And here you can see the road, the parking area, and then all the terrain. The green is simple, the blue is challenging, and the black is complex terrain. And that's pretty much how the terrain mapping has been done in Canada over the last 15 years. During that time, of course, when you build a system, you do the best you can, and then you start to use it and you immediately figure out the things that you wished you'd been able to do with it the first time, and that's why we make revisions. The first one is to do with simple terrain, and I mentioned it a bit earlier, but simple terrain is what I would call almost non-avalanche terrain, but not quite, and that ended up being a bit of a problem. When we first built the system, it was new, and I think the idea of classifying terrain was new enough that it was hard to convince anyone that we would call it non-avalanche terrain. And so we weren't able to get there, so we built almost non-avalanche terrain, which, as you can see, includes the runout zones of infrequent avalanches and small openings in the forest. We've since learned that we need to show non-avalanche terrain, and that's really important. So in our revision, we're going to follow what the zoning model has, and we'll just add a class 0 to this, which might sound simple, but it's actually the most complicated of all the criteria. People get really nervous when you say non-avalanche terrain for large areas in the mountains. And the thing with it is you can't really be uncertain. So if you're going to call it class 0, it needs to be class 0. The other challenge is complex terrain. Now, one of the things about this system is it works really well for introductory users and beginners and things like that, because they're often in simple terrain, challenging. They're trying to decide which one they should use based on this and a combination with a danger rating. But advanced users, people with lots of skill in the backcountry, they're pretty much always in complex terrain. At least where we live and work, most of the big ski tours and the big ice climbs and the stuff that people are doing want to travel through complex terrain. And so this system doesn't really add a lot of value because it doesn't break it apart any further. And we've seen lots of changes in the way terrain is used in the last bunch of years, and we want to adapt to that. And we're going to add a new level at the top end of this thing as well. As well, we're going to remove glaciation. I think it became clear to us that glaciation, I think everyone would agree, it isn't so much a important factor in the formation of avalanches, more of a sort of a terrain magnitude kind of thing. So we're going to remove it here and just make sure this thing is entirely focused on avalanche terrain. So let me give you an example of class 0 and why we would like to use class 0. This is Lake Louise, screenshot from Google Earth. You can see in the middle there is, if anyone's been there before, that's the front of the lake. That's the Chateau Lake Louise, and very busy place. We see millions of people come here every year, less in the winter, but it's still very busy. The blue trails that you're seeing here, the blue lines on the map, are all Parks Canada designated trails. So those are signed, marked. We have brochures. We have a visitor center that's always lined up, and you can get information on these trails. Lots of people want to go snowshoeing in the winter. Lots of people want to go for a walk in the winter, but lots of people don't want to go near avalanche terrain. Just about everybody doesn't want to touch avalanche terrain, and they're really not interested in the difference between the slope angle or simple terrain or challenge. They don't want any of that. All they want to know is that there's no avalanche terrain there. And those trails have no avalanche terrain on them. So we have worked a lot over the years to develop signage, brochures, different methods to try and point out to people where the non-avalanche terrain exists. And we think it would be extremely useful if we could just add a class 0 to our 8 ratings, because we already have the avalanche terrain all broken down according to the other categories. So that's one of our goals. You can also see here a big flat piece of terrain. This is Bow Summit, north of Lake Louise. And in the middle is a big flat, wide open valley. And we have lots of that in our park. That area there, you're not going to start an avalanche. It's pretty much flat and just rolling hills. So it is non-avalanche terrain. These are good places for kids groups to go camping, for people to learn to snowshoe, anything that people don't want to deal with avalanches. That's important to know where that kind of terrain is. I mentioned earlier that AITS is used widely in workplace safety applications and avalanche safety plans, and we think that Class 0 will have a significant application for work sites where people want to either locate a camp or else perhaps what kind of terrain they can travel in. A lot of the workplace safety policies say things like if you're going to travel in complex avalanche terrain, you have to have a certain kind of training. When you travel in simple terrain, you have to have less training. And of course, there's lots of people who work in avalanche or work in the mountains who don't have any avalanche training, and they don't want anything to do with avalanches. So we think Class 0 will be important for that application as well. So let's flip ahead to the other end of the scale and take a look at extreme terrain. So this is a place that has changed a lot in the last years since we first launched this scale. Now this kind of terrain is commonly skied, and I think anybody would agree that these big slopes that once got the occasional track are now tracked out quite a bit. So we want to try and break this apart from simple terrain and point out the extreme terrain areas. The language we've used here, extreme terrain, is not new. It's been used sort of in the vernacular for years. You can see here on the right, small avalanches in isolated areas or extreme terrain. That comes from the danger scale, where we've talked about extreme terrain for the last 10 or 15 years as well. This is an example of some of the terrain in our park, which we will classify as extreme terrain that's getting a ton of traffic. These are, we've become a bit of a mecca for couloir skiing. These are 3 of them here. The one on the left, the Granddaddy, is the most popular. We probably respond, I work with search and rescue, and we probably respond 2 to 3 times a year to the Granddaddy. Someone's had a small avalanche or they've fallen down there. Same with Nereo and Amer. We respond annually to these places, and they get a lot of traffic. So another need to break the extreme terrain out. This is an example of a place in Canuck Creek. This is Mount Cheops on the north side. At the moment, this whole area is classified as complex terrain. But what you'll find is, like these days, lots of people ski, for example, down this line. This is North 5. That's very, well, maybe not very popular, but it's popular. There's definitely people working in there every year. There's entrances. You can ski over here. And that's different from this kind of terrain over here, which is another popular ski run. And so I think by having Class 4 terrain available to us, we'll end up breaking it apart a bit differently. And you can see approximately where we would draw the lines on a piece of terrain like this. And lastly, extreme terrain is going to get used a lot for a lot of the ice climbing routes we have. Banff and Jasper National Park are both meccas. There's, you know, thousands of waterfall ice climbs around here and lots of people coming here to do it. Many of them look like this. This is Polar Circus, which is one of the worst ones, but many of them have tons of avalanche terrain overhead and cliffs through the route and stuff like that. So we think we're going to apply extreme terrain to that area quite regularly as well. So this is what the our new draft looks like, and I should say draft because we're still working through this. We're getting near the end of this, but this is the draft at the moment. You can see non-avalanche terrain at the top, no known exposure to avalanches, very low angled or densely forested slopes located well away from avalanche paths or designated trails with no exposure to avalanches. The other definitions are somewhat similar to how they were. We've done a little bit of wordsmithing, but they're largely the same. The terrain breakdown is the same. And if you go to the bottom, on the other end, you can see exposure to steep faces with cliffs, spines, couloirs, crevasses, or sustained overhead hazard. There's no options to reduce exposure, and even small avalanches can be fatal. So that gives a general sense. This is actually what we used to call the public communication model, but this is the version that we would put in our brochures or, you know, most avalanche safety plans. Any time we need to communicate about avalanche terrain, this is the version we would use. If you move ahead too, you can see, I'll just go through those. There we go. So here's the what was called the technical model. We've now called it the descriptive model. I'll describe to you in a few moments the various methods that have emerged over the years to assess this terrain, but there's different methods these days. All of them are technical. So this one, really what it is a descriptive model of the terrain. It's not anything you're going to program into a computer. It's really for a subjective type assessment. So we're calling it the descriptive model. Again, you can see there's the non-avalanche terrain on the left. I should remind you again that it's draft, and this has changed multiple times with our group over the last 6 months or so. One of the things I'll point out here is under frequency magnitude, the word never. This is something that makes people very nervous, and justifiably so. Until you start trying to classify terrain, then you get the sense when you're about to call something zero and you think to yourself about who's going to go in there and what that means, you realize just how important it is that if you're going to say it's class zero, it has to be never. And so that's why it says optional up here. And so if you're doing classification work and the mapper is uncomfortable or uncertain about the kind of terrain they're working in, then we'll just call it simple. Because simple terrain is almost non-avalanche terrain, but it's got some risk to it, but not much. So that's why we call it optional up here. It's really, you have to be 100% confident that there's no avalanche terrain in this area for you to call it class 0. And then on the other end of this, we have extreme terrain, and you can read some of the breakdowns there. I want to point out again frequency here. Frequency is one of the more important qualifiers in this scale. This is, obviously we've just chosen a round number here, but 10 to 1 for less than or equal to size 2 avalanches. So what that really means is many avalanches annually. Every winter, this thing sloughs and produces avalanches up to size 2 a lot. And it also produces annually at least one avalanche greater than size 2. So just by looking at that alone, you can get a sense of the kind of terrain we're talking about here. No options to reduce exposure, and it's continuous exposure in start zones and tracks. So that's a breakdown of what the descriptive model looks like at this point. In behind that is the zoning parameters. So these come from the zoning method that I was talking to you a little bit about earlier. And this is from Campbell, Gould, and Newby. And this is what's used when you're going to be doing GIS-based mapping using a DEM. So you can set it up so that your GIS can essentially run this quickly, and then you'll have a breakdown of all the terrain according to these numbers here. So this is going to be part of, also, it already is part of the 8 zoning model, so we're going to include it at the back of the revised 8's version 2 here, so that those who are doing DEM mapping have a basis for their slope, angle, and forest breakdown. Just to give you a sense, a little sidetrack off the actual scale itself, but one of the projects that we did this spring, and I guess we finished it in the early summer, was a comparative mapping assessment. We thought it would be useful for a bunch of different reasons. First of all, we wanted to do a comparison between the methods used by Avalanche Canada and the methods used by Parks Canada. Avalanche Canada has a lot more experience with the mapping side of this than Parks Canada does, but we're going to be moving there over the next little while here. So really we wanted to, they mostly use a DEM-based method initially, and then so Avalanche Canada will run the 8's filter through the DEM, and then they'll do their adjustments, and then they'll have it field checked by locals. Whereas our method in Parks is mostly based on human assessment, site surveys, and going out in the field. With minimal use of the DEM in terms of this comparison and how we did it. So we wanted to compare that. We also wanted to provide the people who are working on automated 8's mapping with an example of what manual mapping looks like for their comparison. So John Sykes from Simon Fraser University has a poster at this VSSW, or at the VSSW, and he's going to be talking about the way that the algorithm mapping has been moving forward. So that's automated 8's mapping. And that's very different than the kind of mapping work we're doing here. So we've tried to provide him with a sort of the best manual map that we can make, and they can use that as a comparison against the automated. And the last thing is, you'll see in just a moment all the polygons that emerge on the map when we do this terrain mapping. And we can use the GIS to extract the slope characteristics from those polygons. And that actually is probably the best way that we could fill out and confirm the parameters we have in the descriptive model, is by actually pulling, by doing the mapping work manually. So we've drawn the lines right where we want them on the terrain. And then we can actually extract the characteristics out of the GIS and see actually how steep it is and how thick the forest is in those areas. So that's our plan. It's underway at the moment. I'll give you just a quick example of what it looks like, some of the early work. So this is Canuck Creek, which is a popular ski touring area in Rogers Pass, Glacier National Park in Canada, if you've been there. You can see down here, that's the old hotel in the Rogers Pass Center. Then Canuck Creek, the main ski touring, starts up this drainage right here. Kind of a famous place. Lots of big avalanche terrain up there, and very popular. On busy days, there'll be a couple hundred people ski touring up there. So here's an example of the comparison. So this is Bender's mapping. You can see the green, blue, black, and red for simple, challenging, complex, and extreme terrain. This is Campbell's mapping. Similar, you can see with his, a little bit of class 0 is pulled out of the middle of the forest here. And these, like I said, were largely initially DEM-based methods. That's why they're much more refined with respect to certainly the simple terrain. You can see the polygons have really pulled it out of the forest there. And this is my mapping work, which again, you can see the simple terrain here on the left, class 0, which forms the initial sort of 15 minutes of walking up Canuck Creek. You're just on a trail in the forest. And then up here, you enter the tiger country. So, you know, 3 different ways of doing it. And then what we did is we kept ourselves blind from each other while we were mapping. And then we got together at the end, kind of did the big reveal. And ultimately, we've come up with a consensus map for what we think the ACE ratings in polygons would be for Canuck Creek. And so anyway, this map, really useful for us. We were able to test out some of those parameters for certainly how to use class 0 in this area here, and also the extreme terrain. You know, what do the parameters look like, and do the ones we were using work? Do they fit the kind of terrain? Because, you know, when you build these systems, you know, like, we know where the extreme terrain is. We know where the big tiger country is in here. We've been going up here for years. And so the question is not where is that kind of country, but how do we best describe it accurately that it works on the ACE system? And so that was really the main point of this comparative mapping. And then also we have this consensus map now that we can share with John, and the people who are working on automated ACE mapping can compare their algorithm against this and just see how well it's doing. So since 2004, like I mentioned earlier, ACE has been used in lots of different areas for different things, and it has emerged a bunch of different assessment methods. So I'm showing you kind of our method, which is largely a subjective assessment done in the field, but there's other ways that have emerged as well. This is our main way, a manual mapping and rating based on field work and local knowledge. There's also the method I was showing you from Avalanche Canada, which is DEM-based zoning, and then they have it verified by locals or by themselves if they're in the area, but certainly someone has to get down on the ground and verify the ratings. The system's been used a lot by guidebook and route information authors. I know down here in Colorado, Beacon Guidebooks has used the ACE rating a lot in their guidebooks, and I've seen some of the work. I think it looks excellent. I'd say the same in Canada. There's lots of guidebooks. Just about every ski touring guidebook or ice climbing book that is out these days has some kind of use of ACE in there to classify the different trips. And then what's emerging over the last few years is these automated computer-based algorithms that essentially run the terrain through this algorithm, and it spits out the rating on the other end. And that is a somewhat new method that's underway, but again, it's shows some promise. And there's one thing about all these methods, though, or I like to make 2 important points about them. First of all methods to do this must include exposure. So I think if you use a DEM or an automated method alone, it's not sufficient to get an ACE rating because it just doesn't include the exposure component, which is critical. When you take a look at the scale itself here, you know, you can see on the left slope angle and forest density. I already showed you a specific breakdown that can be used by the computer. You can model shape, terrain traps, the things that are harder to model, but they're nonetheless perhaps the most important parts of this scale are these parts down here. So this is exposure. This is interaction with avalanche paths. That talks about how people would interact with the avalanche terrain while they're moving through it. Route options talks about whether you have, you know, many route options or none if you're just pinned into one spot where you have to commit to the terrain. And exposure time, which is also critical. Are you there for just a moment? Are you there for a long time? How are you exposed to the avalanche terrain? Now, those things are harder to model, but nonetheless, in order to have an ACE rating, that's essential. It's the E part of the scale, exposure. So even if you're not classifying an area that's a trip or a particular ski tour or a particular route, I think you still need to be considering the exposure of people in the terrain. So even if it's not a specific route, if it's a zoned area, you're still thinking, okay, well, up here you're going to be on the left, and over there you can get on that piece of high ground, and here's how you get through that pass. You know, those kinds of ways of looking at the terrain are really essential to get an ACE rating at the other end. And the other piece I would say is that all those methods, they all have different strengths and weaknesses, every one of them. And in the end, they need to land here. So this is where they meet. This is the method that we use to communicate with the public. And whether you have an algorithm or you did a subjective, manual assessment, or if you're using the DEM, when you get to this point, none of that really matters too much, because this is what people are looking at. This is what the person who's using the guidebook looks at, or the person who's adhering to some workplace policy. They're using the communication model. So no matter what your method is, just make sure you always check it back against these messages right here to make sure that you're actually aligned properly and that the terrain really does fit into these categories here, because this is really the 8s right here. Everything else behind it is an assessment method that gets you to this spot. So that's pretty much it. Our goal with this project is to finish up the revisions. They're almost done. We got a little bit more work to do just to come together on a few of those remaining points. And then we hope to publish a paper on it over the winter. I want to thank a number of people for participating. This is our group on the upper left that I've been working with to help with these revisions. It's John Sykes, Havard, Yordi, Carl, Cam, and Mark. Those folks have all been helping with the actual revision itself. For Parks Canada, I've had Mark, Alex, Chris, Mike, and Danielle have been working on that terrain assessment with me, and appreciated all their local inputs. And we have a great geomatics staff at Parks Canada. We're lucky to have really well staffed up for GIS applications. So Nicole, Josh, Ben, and Melissa all participated as well to help. So that's pretty much it. Again, my name's Grant Statham. You can see my email down there. If anyone has any questions, you can feel free to email me. I'll do my best to answer them. I guess that's pretty much it. We'll wrap it up here, but thanks a lot for listening, and I look forward to the discussion coming up at CSAW in just a few weeks. Take care. Bye.